You're lying awake thinking about them, and somewhere, in an apartment, in a bedroom, in the quiet that descends when the noise of the day finally stops, they're lying awake thinking about you too. They just won't tell you that, and the not telling you is almost worse than if they felt nothing at all, because nothing would be clean. Nothing would be a door that closes, and you could eventually stop standing in front of it. But this is different. This is someone who feels it and buries it and shows you a face in the daytime that gives you almost nothing, while the nighttime does to them exactly what it does to you. And you can feel it. You can't prove it. You can't point to it. But somewhere underneath all the silence and the distance and the carefully maintained coolness, you know something is still there. You're not crazy for feeling that. You're actually reading them more accurately than they're reading themselves. Here's what's actually happening when the lights go out. The night is when their defenses go off the clock. During the day, an avoidant is managed. That's the only word for it. They are a managed person. Every interaction is filtered through a system that has been running so long they don't even notice it anymore. A constant, automatic process of regulating how much they feel, how much they show, how much they allow in. It is exhausting work, and most of them don't know they're doing it. It just feels like being themselves. But the night removes the scaffolding. The distractions disappear. The work, the noise, the movement that keeps the inner world at a manageable distance, all of it goes quiet. And what's left, in that silence, is everything the daytime successfully kept at arm's length. You are in that silence, specifically and persistently. This is not a small thing. Understand what it means for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built around not needing, not wanting, not reaching, to lie in the dark and find that the wanting is right there anyway, unmanaged, unfiltered, real in a way that the daytime version of themselves would immediately shut down. The night is when the avoidant meets the part of themselves they spend all day avoiding, and that part, the undefended part, the honest part, misses you in a way that would probably surprise you if you could see it directly. The question is what they do with that, because what they do with it is both completely understandable and quietly maddening, and it explains a pattern you've probably noticed without being able to name. They replay you, not the arguments, not the hard moments, though those surface too eventually. First, before anything else, they replay the good, the specific, textured, sensory good, the sound of your laugh in a particular moment, the way a conversation went that felt easy and real, a specific night, a specific look, something small that lodged itself so deep it bypasses all the careful distance and just arrives fully formed in the quiet. Avoidants have exceptional emotional memory for the people who actually got through, and here is why that matters. The avoidant defense system works by minimizing, by turning down the volume on attachment, on feeling, on the importance of connection. During the day, that minimizing works reasonably well. They can tell themselves it wasn't that serious, that they're fine, that space is what they needed, and space is what they have, and that is perfectly okay. But memory doesn't minimize the way conscious thought does. Memory stores things at full volume. And at night, when the minimizing mechanism is running low on fuel, the memories play at the volume they were actually recorded at, which means they feel it, the full weight of what was between you, unmediated by the story they've been telling themselves about not needing it. And then, and this is the part that will make you want to shake them, they don't do anything with it. They feel it completely. They sit inside it, and then they pack it back up, and they go to sleep, and they wake up in the morning, and they put the managed version of themselves back on, and they carry on as if none of it happened. That is not coldness. That is a level of emotional compartmentalization so practiced and so thorough that it functions almost like a superpower. A terrible, self-defeating superpower, but a superpower nonetheless. They check on you without contacting you. This is one of the most specific and telling behaviors an avoidant engages in when they miss someone, and it almost never gets talked about. They look quietly, without leaving a trace if they can help it. They find ways to know how you're doing without having to enter the vulnerability of actually asking. They pay attention to mutual connections. They notice things. They keep a peripheral awareness of your life running in the background, even while their foreground behavior suggests complete indifference. The psychology behind this is worth understanding because it reveals something important about the avoidance inner experience. Reaching out directly, texting, calling, initiating any form of real contact requires them to be visible, to show their hand, to demonstrate that they care enough to close the distance, which means admitting to themselves and to you that the distance is bothering them. That is too much exposure, too much vulnerability. The risk-reward calculation doesn't clear the bar their system requires before it will allow that kind of openness. But doing nothing feels unbearable in those nighttime hours when the missing is loudest. So they find the middle option, the option that lets them care for you without having to show you that they're caring. That lets them check that you're okay without having to admit that your okayness matters to them. This is not manipulation. It is not a game. It is someone who genuinely cares, genuinely misses, and genuinely cannot find a way through the wall their own psychology has built. So they press their face against it in the dark and look through the cracks instead. Does it make you feel better to know this? It probably shouldn't. Not completely. Because the fact that they miss you in private while remaining unavailable in public doesn't actually change your situation. It doesn't give you what you need. It doesn't close the distance. And knowing they're out there quietly tracking your life from a careful remove is not the same as having them actually present in it, but it does tell you something about the reality of what they feel, which matters, not as a reason to wait indefinitely. That conversation is coming, but as a correction to the story that says they felt nothing. That you imagined the whole thing, that the connection was one-sided. It was not one-sided. It is not one-sided. The sidedness of it is in the expression, not the feeling. They write things they never send. Not everyone, but more than you'd expect, and in more forms than just writing. There are messages drafted and deleted, thoughts formulated into words, and then swallowed, things they almost said, almost sent, almost did, and then didn't. The impulse fires, and the defense system catches it before it clears the gate. What's significant about this is not the content of the unsent thing. It's the fact that the impulse existed at all. Because the impulse to reach out, to say something, to close the distance even for a moment, that impulse is evidence of the feeling pushing up against the wall hard enough to almost break through. The avoidant experiences the moment, that almost as a kind of internal conflict that is genuinely uncomfortable. The part of them that wants connection is in direct combat with the part of them that is terrified of what connection costs. And in that conflict, in the nighttime quiet where the wanting is loudest, they will sometimes come extremely close to doing the thing that would change everything. And then they don't. And the morning comes, and the managed version returns, and you never know how close it got. This is important to understand not because it changes what you should do. It doesn't. But because it reframes the silence. The silence is not emptiness. It is not indifference. It is the sound of someone fighting with themselves and losing to the part that's afraid. Every single time. The silence is not about you. The silence is about the war inside them that you are not privy to and cannot fight on their behalf. They convince themselves you're fine without them. Here is something avoidants do that is so specific and so psychologically revealing that when you hear it, something is probably going to click. In the night, when they miss you, they manage the missing by constructing a version of your life in which you are completely okay, better even, moving forward, not missing them back with anything close to the intensity they're privately feeling. This is not wishful thinking. It is a defense mechanism that serves two purposes simultaneously. First, it reduces the guilt. If you're fine, then the distance they've created hasn't hurt you, and they don't have to sit with the discomfort of having caused pain to someone they care about. Second, and more importantly, it makes the reaching out feel unnecessary. If you're fine, then closing the distance isn't urgent. There's no rescue needed, no wrong to correct. The avoidant can stay in the safer move of not reaching out, because the story they've told themselves says nothing is broken. What they're actually doing, underneath all of that, is protecting themselves from the terrifying possibility that you do miss them. Because if you miss them, if reaching out would actually be received, actually be wanted, then the excuse for not reaching out dissolves. And without that excuse, they are face to face with the choice in its raw form. Do I close this distance or don't I? Do I let this person back in or don't I? Do I risk what closeness costs me? That is too much to hold in the dark. So they tell themselves you're fine. You've moved on. You're probably out living your life, unbothered, and the connection that felt so significant to them was probably less significant to you. They are almost certainly wrong about this, and on some level they probably know they are. What all of this is actually telling you, let's be straight about something. Everything described here, the replaying, the quiet checking, the unsent messages, the stories they construct about your indifference, none of it is communication. None of it is closeness. None of it gives you anything real or usable or present in your actual life. A person missing you in private while remaining unavailable in public is not the same as a person who is there. Feeling and showing up are two different things, and a relationship cannot be built on what someone feels in the dark if they consistently refuse to bring it into the light. This is where a lot of people get stuck. They find out, or they sense, accurately, that the avoidance still has feelings, that the missing is real, that the connection didn't just evaporate, and they take that information and they use it as a reason to keep waiting, to keep being available, to keep the door open indefinitely on the grounds that the feeling is still alive in the other person. But here is what you need to hear directly, without softening. Feelings that never become actions are not a relationship. They are a private experience that one person is having while you sit waiting for a door to open, that they are not currently walking toward. Their nighttime missing does not obligate you to anything. Their private grief over the distance they created does not require you to maintain a holding pattern around your own life. You are allowed to know that they still feel something and simultaneously decide that feeling alone is not enough. Those two things can be true at the same time. The avoidance inner world, rich and feeling and privately aching in all the ways described here, is real, but it is also inaccessible to you in any practical sense until they choose to make it accessible. And choosing to make it accessible requires a level of courage and self-confrontation that cannot be outsourced to you, cannot be prompted by your patience, and cannot be rushed by your love, however large and real that love is. What you do with that knowledge, that they feel it and they're not bringing it to you, is the most important question you're currently sitting with. And the answer to it has to come from a completely honest assessment of what you actually have versus what you hope is coming. From a real look at the pattern of their behavior over time, not just the feeling underneath it. Because the feeling underneath it has always been there, and you are still here, aren't you? So the feeling alone is not enough to change things. Something else has to change, and that something is entirely inside them. The only question that actually matters is whether you're willing to wait for a change you cannot control, cannot predict, and cannot make happen, and what that waiting is costing you while you do it. That cost is real, and it deserves to be taken as seriously as the feeling that's keeping you there. Here's the thing nobody wants to say to you directly, so I will. You already know the answer to that question, the one about whether to keep waiting. You've known it for a while now, maybe longer than you're comfortable admitting. But knowing something and being ready to act on it are two completely different experiences, and the gap between them is where most people spend months, sometimes years, of their lives. The gap has a name. It's called hope. And hope, when it's attached to someone who is not currently showing up for you, is one of the most expensive things a person can carry. Not because hope is wrong. Hope is not wrong. But hope without evidence is just pain with a prettier name. And you have been in that pain long enough to deserve something more honest than a reframe that makes the waiting feel noble. So let's talk about what's actually keeping you in it, not what you tell other people, not the version that sounds reasonable and measured, the real thing, the thing that lives underneath all the explaining and the understanding and the patience. Because that thing, whatever it is the actual conversation worth having right now. The fantasy is the problem, not the feeling. The feeling is real. Say that to yourself again because it matters. What you felt with this person, what you still feel, is not a delusion. It is not a projection. It is not you being naive or desperate or incapable of seeing clearly. The connection was real. The moments were real. The version of them that let you in, that was warm and present and genuine. That person exists. You did not invent them. But here is where it gets complicated. The person you are waiting for, the one you are keeping the door open for, the one whose nighttime missing you've been holding on to as evidence that this isn't over. That person is not entirely the person who actually exists. They are partly real and partly constructed, partly who they are and partly who they could be if they chose to do the work, if the conditions were right, if something shifted in them at the level where shifts actually need to happen. The fantasy is the could be, the potential, the version of them at their best moments promised and their patterns consistently failed to deliver. And the fantasy is not a lie. It is built from real material. That is exactly what makes it so hard to release. You are not holding on to something imaginary. You are holding on to something that was real in glimpses and promised to become consistent and never quite did. That specific grief, the grief of almost, is one of the hardest griefs there is because it has no clean object. You can't point to it and say this was the loss, this was the moment, this is what ended. It's diffuse, it's ongoing. It lives in the space between what was and what could have been and what keeps not arriving no matter how long you wait. And the fantasy keeps the grief from completing. Because as long as you believe the could be is still possible, as long as the nighttime missing and the almost sent messages and the quiet checking feel like evidence that something is still alive and moving toward you, the grief has nowhere to land. It just circulates, endlessly, keeping you in a kind of emotional suspension that feels like hope and functions like a holding cell. The fantasy needs to be looked at directly, not destroyed. You cannot destroy something real by force, but seen clearly, seen for what it is. The real parts acknowledged, the constructed parts identified, and the question asked honestly is what actually exists right now in the present tense, without the potential and the almost and the one day. Is that enough? Is that something you would choose if it were offered to you as a permanent arrangement rather than a temporary state on the way to something better? For most people, sitting with that question honestly, the answer is no. What actually exists is not enough. What they are staying for is the version that hasn't arrived yet. And staying for a version that hasn't arrived yet, with no concrete evidence it's on its way, is not love. It is investment in a future that exists only inside your own hope. Why you keep going back to the nighttime stuff. Let's talk about why you came to this in the first place. Why the idea that they miss you at night, that in their private, undefended moments, they feel the full weight of what's between you. Why that matters so much to you. Why knowing it or believing it changes something in how you're able to carry this. It matters because it makes the pain mean something. Because if they feel nothing, then everything you went through was just wasteful, a mistake, evidence of poor judgment, something that happened to you rather than something that existed between two people. And that interpretation is unbearable, not just emotionally, almost existentially. It calls into question your ability to read situations, to trust your own perceptions, to believe that what feels real to you has any correspondence to what is actually happening. Knowing they miss you in private restores the meaning. It confirms that the connection was what it felt like, that you weren't wrong about them, that the love was mutual, even if the expression of it was catastrophically unequal. That is a legitimate need. The need to have your experience validated, the need to know that what you felt was felt on the other side too. There is nothing pathological about wanting that. It is one of the most human needs there is. But here is the thing about using their private missing as your source of validation. It requires you to stay focused on them, on their inner world, on what they might be feeling in the dark when you can't see it and they won't tell you. And that focus, that sustained attention directed outward toward the interior life of someone who isn't giving you access to it, keeps you perpetually in a position of waiting for information that may never arrive in the form you need it. You deserve validation that doesn't require you to speculate about someone else's private emotional state. You deserve confirmation that arrives directly, clearly, in the form of someone showing up and saying, with their presence, with their consistency, with their actual behavior over time, you matter to me and I am choosing you, not in the dark, not in the unsent message, out loud, in the light, in the daily, ordinary, unremarkable texture of a relationship where both people are present and both people know it. That is not asking too much. That is asking for the minimum that a real relationship requires, and framing it as too much, which you have probably been doing, quietly, to make the current situation more acceptable, is one of the ways you have been underselling yourself for longer than you should have. The avoidant is not sitting still either. Here is something that tends to get left out of conversations about what avoidants do when they miss you. All the nighttime behavior, the replaying, the checking, the constructed stories about your indifference. None of it is static. It is not a fixed state they are sitting in, faithfully missing you, waiting for the courage to finally close the distance. They are also moving, distracting themselves, finding ways to manage the missing during the hours when the managing is possible, filling the space with work, with other people, with whatever gives their system relief from the feeling they don't know how to sit with. This is not betrayal. It is not evidence that the missing isn't real. It is what people do with feelings they cannot process. They move around them, they find the edges of the feeling, and they live in the spaces between. But it does mean that the picture of the avoidant lying awake, night after night, in an agony of missing and longing and suppressed reaching, that picture, while emotionally real in certain moments, is not the whole truth. The whole truth is more complicated. They miss you, and they distract themselves from missing you. They feel it deeply in the unguarded moments, and they successfully avoid it in the guarded ones. They almost reach out, and then they don't, and then an hour later they're absorbed in something else. And the almost feels very far away. Their life is continuing. The feeling is real, but the life continues around it. And this matters because it challenges one of the quiet assumptions that can keep a person waiting. The assumption that while you are here, in the pain, doing the work, sitting with the grief and the hope and the confusion, they are equally suspended, equally arrested, equally unable to move forward. They are not. Nobody is. And recognizing that their life is moving forward, that the missing coexists with a life that keeps happening, is important information about the nature of what you are waiting for. You are not waiting for someone who is frozen in time, unable to function until you reconnect. You are waiting for someone who has, in some measure, found a way to carry this and keep going, which means they are capable of carrying it indefinitely. And that capability, the capacity to feel it and still not act on it, is something their system has spent decades refining. It will not spontaneously stop working, not without a genuine, chosen, internally motivated decision on their part to do something different. And that decision cannot be prompted from the outside. What changes when you stop waiting? There is a version of you on the other side of this that is not organized around them, not defined by the dynamic, not running on the fuel of hope and almost and nighttime missing. A version of you that has taken all of the love and attention and energy that has been flowing outward toward them, toward the relationship, toward the understanding and the patience and the waiting, and redirected it, not as a strategy, not to make them notice, just because it is the right place for it to go. That version of you is not over them in some clean, cinematic way. It doesn't work like that, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. The feeling doesn't vanish When you decide to stop waiting, the missing doesn't evaporate. There will still be nights. You will not be immune to the quiet and what it brings up, but the quality of it changes. Because when you stop organizing your life around the hope of their return, the pain stops being an emergency. It becomes something you move through rather than something you're trapped inside. It loses its urgency. And when pain loses its urgency, you get your life back. The bandwidth that has been consumed by monitoring, hoping, analyzing, waiting, that comes back to you. And you find, sometimes with genuine surprise, that there is a significant amount of yourself that has been sitting in reserve, waiting for you to have room for it again. That version of you is more attractive, yes, but framing it that way misses the point. More importantly, that version of you is more present, more available to the things and people directly in front of you, more capable of recognizing and receiving something real when it actually shows up. Because you're no longer filtering everything through the lens of a relationship that is somewhere else with someone else, at a remove you cannot close. And here is the thing about avoidance specifically that is worth saying plainly. The version of you that is genuinely stopped waiting, not performed stopping, not strategically withdrawn, hoping they'll notice, but actually redirected your life toward itself. That version is the one most likely to produce any movement in them, if movement is ever going to come. Not because you become a better bait, but because the dynamic has fundamentally changed. Because you are no longer the anxious, available, orbiting presence that their system learned to take for granted and retreat from. You have become something their attachment system does not have a script for. Someone who loved them genuinely and completely, and then, when it wasn't enough, chose themselves, without drama, without ultimatum. Just a quiet, clear decision that your life was going to be lived rather than held in suspension. That is disarming in a way that nothing else is. It does not guarantee they come back. It does not guarantee anything about them. But it guarantees something about you. It guarantees that whatever comes next, whether they return or they don't, whether this was the relationship or just the one that taught you what the relationship needs to look like, you are living your life, actually living it. Not waiting for permission from someone else's emotional availability to begin. The last honest thing, they miss you at night. That part is true. The replaying is real. The almost reaching is real. The private ache that their daytime self works hard to keep under control. All of it is real. You were not wrong about what was there. You did not imagine the connection or the feeling or the significance of what was between you. And they may keep missing you for a long time. People with avoidant attachment do not stop feeling things. They stop showing them. The feeling can persist for years in that private, unaddressed, never quite resolved place that their inner world reserves for the people who actually got through. But you are a person who exists in the daytime, who needs love that shows up in real time, in real life, with real consistency. You are not a memory someone replays in the dark. You are not an almost sent message. You are not a quiet check from a careful distance. You are someone who deserves to be chosen, out loud, repeatedly, by someone who is not fighting themselves to do it. The nighttime missing is real, and it is not enough. And knowing both of those things at the same time, holding the reality of what they feel alongside the reality of what that feeling has and has not produced, is not cynicism, it is clarity. And clarity, as uncomfortable as it is right now, is the first morning after a very long night. You have been in the dark long enough. It's time. You just listened to all of that, and part of you is sitting there nodding, feeling seen, feeling like things finally make sense. And then there's this other part, quieter, stubborn, already looking for the exit, already thinking, but my situation is different. And that right there, that specific thought, that is exactly what we need to talk about, because that thought is not logic. That is not you being a careful, nuanced thinker who recognizes complexity. That is your attachment system doing what it was built to do, protecting the hope, keeping the door open, finding any available reason to stay in the familiar pain rather than walk into the unfamiliar work of actually moving forward. And it is so convincing. That is the part that gets people. It does not feel like avoidance. It feels like wisdom. It feels like you are the one person who truly understands the nuance of this specific relationship, and everyone else is painting with too broad a brush. Here is the question worth sitting with, though. How long have you been the exception to your own advice? How many times have you told a friend, clearly, confidently, exactly what they needed to do about someone who wasn't showing up for them, and then turned around and applied a completely different standard to yourself, a more generous standard, a more patient standard, a standard with significantly more room for almost and potential and one day? That gap between the clarity you have for everyone else and the fog you live in when it comes to this, that is not a coincidence. That is attachment. That is the specific, personal, deeply lodged way that this dynamic has its hooks in you. And recognizing it is not enough to dissolve it, but it is the beginning of something. The loop you have been living in, here is what the loop actually looks like from the outside. And be honest with yourself about how much of this is familiar. They pull back. You feel the panic. The panic produces behavior, reaching, over-explaining, withdrawing to punish, giving with an agenda, all the things that make it worse. The behavior triggers more distance from them. The distance increases the panic. The panic produces more behavior, around and around, each cycle confirming their belief that closeness is dangerous and your belief that you are somehow not enough to make them stay. And in between the cycles, in the brief windows of warmth and connection, the loop gets reinforced from the other direction. Because those windows feel so good, so disproportionately good, relative to what a normal moment of connection in a healthy relationship would feel like. Because the relief of closeness after the anxiety of distance produces something in the brain that is genuinely chemically significant. It is not just emotionally satisfying. It is neurologically activating in a way that consistent, available love simply does not replicate. This is why people stay, not because they are weak or foolish or incapable of seeing clearly, but because the intermittent reward has created a neurological attachment that is stronger and more consuming than what most stable relationships produce. The brain does not bond most deeply to what is consistently good. It bonds most deeply to what is unpredictably, occasionally, intensely good against a background of uncertainty. You are not addicted to them. You are addicted to the cycle, to the specific rhythm of anxiety and relief that this dynamic produces. And understanding that distinction is important because it means the work of detaching is not just emotional, it is physiological. Your nervous system has been trained by this pattern, and retraining it requires more than deciding to be done. It requires time and different experiences and the willingness to sit with the discomfort of withdrawal. Real withdrawal, the kind that feels almost physical in its intensity, without immediately seeking relief from the source of the addiction. That is hard. Genuinely, significantly hard. And anyone who tells you it should be easy, that if you just understood enough, you could think your way out of it cleanly and quickly, they are not being straight with you. What you actually owe them and what you don't. Something needs to be addressed directly because it keeps people stuck in a way that does not get talked about enough. You feel responsible for them, not in a conscious, articulated way necessarily, but somewhere underneath everything else. There is a sense that leaving, truly redirecting your life away from this would be a kind of abandonment, that they are wounded, that you understand the wound, that walking away from someone whose patterns you can trace back to a frightened child who learned to survive by not needing, that feels cruel in a way that is very hard to shake. That feeling is not nothing. It comes from empathy, which is real and good and worth keeping. But it is being misapplied, and the misapplication is costing you in ways that compound every day you stay in it. Here is what you actually owe them: honesty, basic human decency, the absence of cruelty. If there is a conversation to be had, having it rather than disappearing, treating them with the dignity that any person deserves, regardless of how the relationship ends or changes. Here is what you do not owe them: your indefinite availability, while they figure out whether they can show up. Your emotional life held in suspension around their timeline, your healing postponed around their readiness, your needs deprioritized because their wounds are more visible and more easily explained. Compassion for someone's wounds does not obligate you to be the surface those wounds express themselves on. Understanding why someone is the way they are does not require you to absorb the impact of it indefinitely. You can hold genuine empathy for what shaped them and simultaneously decide that you are not the right person in the right conditions at the right time to be the relationship in which they work it out. Those two things can live together. They have to live together because without that boundary, compassion becomes self-erasure. And self-erasure is not love. It is the slow disappearance of a person, and you have already been disappearing for longer than you should have. The conversation you need to have with yourself, not with them, with yourself. Because at some point, the analysis has to stop. At some point, the understanding of their psychology, of the dynamic, of the attachment theory and the nervous system and the childhood wounds, at some point, all of that has to give way to something simpler and more direct, a conversation that does not require any frameworks or any understanding of anyone else's interior life, just you and the honest answer to a small number of very direct questions. Are you happy? Not sometimes, not in the good moments. On balance, across the full texture of your daily life as it currently exists, are you happy? Are you growing? Is the person you are today more expanded, more alive, more yourself than the person you were before this relationship or dynamic began? Or are you smaller, more careful, more anxious, more defined by someone else's rhythms than your own? Is what you currently have not the potential, not the almost, not the best moments, but what is actually consistently, reliably present? Is that something you would actively choose if you were choosing from a place of fullness rather than from the fear of losing something you've already invested so much in? Those questions do not have complex answers. They have honest ones. And the honest answers are usually available immediately, in the gut, before the mind has a chance to start negotiating with them. The mind will negotiate. It will offer qualifications and context and reasons why the gut response is too simple. Let it do that, and then go back to the gut response. Because the gut has been trying to tell you something for a while now, and it has been remarkably patient with all the negotiating. What moving forward actually looks like not moving on, moving forward. The distinction matters. Moving on implies you get over it, that it stops mattering, that you arrive at some destination where the feeling is resolved and the person is irrelevant and everything is clean. That is not what happens. That is not what is being suggested here. Moving forward means your life resumes its forward direction with this experience integrated into it rather than organized around it. It means the grief is real and present and felt fully rather than managed through the ongoing hope that it won't have to be grief at all. It means you stop deferring your life, your actual, full, three-dimensional life, to the timeline of someone else's readiness. It looks like small things at first, filling the time that was previously consumed by monitoring and analyzing and waiting with things that have nothing to do with this dynamic, not as distraction. Distraction is just another form of avoidance, but as genuine reinvestment in the friendships that got deprioritized, in the interests that went quiet, in the version of yourself that existed before this became the central organizing fact of your emotional life. It looks like sitting with the discomfort of not knowing what they're doing, not checking, not finding the indirect ways to stay connected, letting the silence be actual silence, rather than a space you're constantly filling with speculation and hope. That silence will be uncomfortable at first. It will feel like loss, because it is loss. Let it be loss. Let it have the full weight of what it is, rather than padding it with the possibility that it might not be permanent. And it looks like gradually, not immediately, not on a schedule, but gradually becoming available to your own life in a way you have not been for some time, available to the present moment, rather than perpetually oriented toward a future that is contingent on someone else's choices, available to the people around you who are actually here, actually consistent, actually choosing you in the plain daylight without any of the complexity. That availability is not settling. It is not giving up on depth or intensity or real feeling. It is refusing to accept the counterfeit version of those things, the version that delivers intensity through anxiety and depth through pain and feeling through the constant nearness of loss, in place of the real ones. The real ones exist. Love that is intense because it is genuine, not because it is uncertain. Depth that comes from two people both willing to go there, not from one person excavating while the other one watches from a careful distance. Feeling that is sustainable because it is not built on the adrenaline of almost. That is available to you. It is not a consolation prize for people who couldn't make the complicated thing work. It is what the complicated thing was always supposed to lead you toward, not by delivering it, but by teaching you, in the most thorough and expensive way possible, exactly what you actually need and what you will no longer accept in its absence. You paid for that knowledge. It cost you real time and real pain and a significant amount of yourself. Don't waste it by going back to the same lesson. You already know what you know. The only question left is what you do with it. And you already know that too.